there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. Today, I'm going to do something that I have wanted to do for a while, which is a Q&A episode. I have a bunch of questions that have come in through various places online, and I'm going to answer as many as I can in today's episode. Next week's episode, we'll be back to our 2-week forecast. So if you're looking for that, I hope you'll listen along today, but definitely tune in again next week. So let's begin. There are lots of questions that people are asking about. I think the first question I'm going to start with comes from Arlene. Arlene writes, I have my Sun, Mercury, Venus, Neptune, Saturn, Uranus, and North Node all in Capricorn. Arlene, straight away, I know you were born in 1990, towards the end of the year or the very start of 1991. And Arlene is asking, is it common to have this many placements in one sign? Am I doomed to a difficult life with so many Capricorn placements? And she says, some people have a reaction when I share this info, and I can't understand why. I'm a total astrology novice for context. So Arlene, first of all, I want to reassure you that just having a lot of planets in one sign doesn't mean that you are doomed at all. There are many charts that I have seen over the years in professional practice where just one little thing can cause, a lot of pressure or worry for a person, and they have planets all over their chart. So just having a lot of planets in one sign, maybe it's technically a stellium, maybe it's not, isn't a guarantee of a problem. So let's talk about this a little bit more. The reason I know that Arlene is born in 1990 or 1991 is that we had a lineup of planets, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, in Capricorn for a couple of years around 1990, 1991, which means that for certain months of those years, when the quicker moving planets also came into Capricorn, we had these very large pileup of planets. This happens periodically. We had a pileup in Libra around 1981, 1982. Saturn and Pluto were in Libra at one point. Saturn and Jupiter were in Libra at one point. There was also a Mars retrograde in Libra. So there are various charts in the early 1980s that have lots of planets in Libra. I've also worked with clients born in 1962, where we had a huge pileup of planets in Aquarius. So periodically it does happen that with the slower movement of the outer planets, we end up with an emphasis or a concentration of a group of planets in a particular sign. And we get these sort of subset generations of people that are, oh, you're the 1990 Capricorn version, or you're the 1962 Aquarius version, with all those planets in Aquarius. So I guess what you're really asking, Arlene, is what does it mean when there is a collection of planets in the one place? So there's a couple of ways that I would break this down for a client. At a very kind of surface level, when we just look at your birth chart, there will be a large gathering or pileup of planets in one sign. Because I work with whole sign houses, that also means I would see all of those planets in the same house. Now, Arlene, you did supply your birth details, which I appreciate. I can see that you have a Gemini rising or a Gemini ascendant, and that places all your Capricorn planets into the 8th house. Now, the way that I would break this down as a traditionally oriented astrologer, I would be thinking about each planet that is in Capricorn and what they are responsible for in the chart and in the life. For instance, you have the Sun in Capricorn in the 8th house. Now, because the Sun's in the 8th house, we know you're born in the daytime. So the Sun takes on that really important criteria of being your sect light. And that's a technique we get from ancient Greek or Hellenistic astrology. So the Sun's really important. The Sun's in the 8th house, the Sun's in Capricorn. So we would be thinking about a deep fascination with 8th house topics. And that can be a mix of psychology, motivation, the psyche, what makes the brain work. can also be a fascination with exploring fear and worry. What do I get worried about and why? What do other people get worried about and why? So that's sort of the psychological internal side of the eighth house in a nutshell, of course. And then the eighth house also has this very practical side where it is associated with money, but particularly money from what we call a shared money perspective. So debts, loans, student loans, car loans, mortgages, credit cards, these are all eighth house money experiences. Taxes is also something that's an eighth house topic. The way you manage money with a romantic partner or a business partner, also eighth house. We also have things like inheritances connected to the eighth house. And of course, the eighth house is traditionally associated with death. Having a lot of planets in the eighth house is not an indication of how long you'll live or how healthy you might be, but it may tell us that you're very curious about the process of death and dying, or that you're interested in the grieving process, whether you've experienced that yourself or whether you want to support others. These are just some very simple themes that may be emphasized for you by having a lot of planets in the eighth house. The two planets I think that are really important that catch my attention in the context of your chart, Arlene, is that you have a Gemini rising. So Mercury becomes really important in your chart as the ruling planet of your ascendant. Mercury is in the eighth house as well. And you have an Aquarius midheaven, which is traditionally ruled by Saturn, and Saturn is placed in that Capricorn eighth house. So having the ascendant ruler and the midheaven ruling planet plus the sect light, all those planets are in the eighth house. So those three planets to me really indicate this person, through their identity and through their work in this world, are really exploring eighth house themes and topics. Now, you may go through different explorations, different parts of the eighth house at different points in your life, in your career. And so these are some of the themes that I would be thinking about in terms of how to break down having all those planets in Capricorn in the eighth house for you. I totally understand that some people will have a reaction when you share things like that. And that says more about them than what it says about your chart. In the same way that people, judging us for things outside astrology says more about the person making the judgment than about us. I can also see, other things in your chart that I think are absolutely glorious. Venus in Capricorn. Venus is quite happy in the sign of Capricorn. Even though she's in the eighth house, she has a lot of solid, earthy, reliable energy there. You have the moon in Pisces. The moon is waxing. Looks like the moon is in kind of the late crescent phase. So the moon is really growing and has a lot to offer. There's a lot of compassion the moon in Pisces offers. There's a lot of insight and intuition. You also have one of my favorite Jupiter placements. I love seeing Jupiter in either Aries or Leo, and I note that you have Jupiter in Leo in your chart. So there is a lot to talk about in terms of the Capricorn planets, but there are other things in your chart that I think are adding in their energy to the mix. So the reason I think some people have a reaction when you talk about, oh, I have this slightly unique type of chart, personally, it's my sense that maybe they haven't seen that many charts and it's kind of a new thing for them as well, and they don't know how to respond to that. So I wouldn't get too concerned for that, but I would encourage you to continue your exploration of the eighth house as you go forward with your journey in astrology. So that's a great question, Arlene. Thank you. So our next question comes from Mary, and Mary is asking about inconjunct or quincunx planets. And specifically, Mary is asking about her own chart where her sun and her moon are in a quincunx or inconjunct aspect. And Mary says, would you have any insight about these placements and the aspect, or any tips for someone who has the quincunx sun and moon? So, Mary, this answer may not be quite what you're expecting. As a traditionally oriented astrologer, I work with the 5 classical aspects. So the aspects that I use in my practice: conjunction, sextile, square, trine, and opposition. I have learned in many styles of astrology. I've studied a variety of styles of astrology over my 20+ year career. And these are the 5 aspects that I have found to be most important, most influential, and they're where I spend all my time working with clients. From a traditional astrology perspective, the quincunx aspect is called an aversion. And we actually describe that as 2 planets that can't see each other. And so there are actually 2 places, 2 types of aspects in modern astrology that fulfill that ancient astrology criteria of aversion. One of them would be what's called the semi-sextile, when planets are in signs next to each other. And the other one is this quincunx or in conjunct, where planets are at that 150-degree aspect, or they're in signs, they're 5 signs apart. And so so my definition of that would be, these planets would be in aversion. But there's also a different way that a traditional astrologer would think about this, which is, unless there is a reason to try to think about whether the sun and moon are in aspect or not, I wouldn't necessarily go down that road per se. One of the things we do a lot in traditional astrology is we look at planets and we look at the houses they rule, remembering that a planet is kind of the manager of the house that it rules. So in your chart, Mary, thank you also for supplying your birth data. I see that you have a Sagittarius rising, which would place Leo on the whole sign 9th house in your chart. And so I would be thinking, okay, you have the sun in the sign of Aquarius. It rules the Leo house, the 9th house. It is making an opposition to the house it rules, because Aquarius we know is opposite Leo. So straight away, I think the sun can see the part of the chart that it is in charge of, and that is going to be helpful for the sun keeping an eye on the topics of the 9th house for you. So if you're thinking about replicating this in your chart, you would think about, what house do I have Leo on the cusp in my own chart? And is the sun placed in a sign or a house where it is making one of those classical aspects to the Leo house? That's kind of how we use part of this concept in ancient styles of astrology. The moon you have in Virgo, which would sit in your whole sign 10th house. We know, of course, the moon rules the sign of Cancer. Cancer sits on your whole sign 8th house. So from Virgo to Cancer, we have a sextile pattern. And so the moon can see the house that it is in. So if we're trying to think about, 9th house topics, which the sun is responsible for, and 8th house topics, which the moon is responsible for, and whether we're able to get agreement between 8th house and 9th house topics, that's when the sun ruling the 9th and the moon ruling the 8th, not being in a classical aspect, could be a bit of an issue for you. So that's how I would think about it. Looking at your chart though, Mary, I see with the Sagittarius rising, I would be very interested in Jupiter's placement in your chart. Jupiter is the ruling planet of your ascendant. And because you're born at nighttime, the sun is in the 3rd house. That means the moon becomes the sect light, the guiding light of your chart. And just a little sidebar for Mary and for anyone else, in this ancient style of astrology that I practice, the moon becomes really important in a nighttime chart. I know modern styles of astrology really focus very strongly on the sun, but keep in mind that at nighttime, the sun is not giving off any light. And so we look to the moon in a more significant and influential way for nighttime charts. And so your moon, Mary, is sitting high in the sky in the 10th whole sign house. It would be late in the full moon phase. It's quite a big moon. And I would really be diving into the aspects that the moon is making. The moon is very close to the south node, K2 in your chart. And I would be really thinking about the spiritualization influence of the south node, but also that tendency to give off or to give away, which is a really common theme of the south node. So for me personally, Mary, I wouldn't be concerned about the fact the sun and moon are in conjunct in your chart. My way of working with the chart and getting into the planets, what they mean and what they're doing in the chart is a little different coming from that traditional perspective. So even though that might have been a different answer than you were expecting, hopefully that is giving you some different ways to think about this. And maybe you're realizing it's not as an important thing as perhaps you originally thought. So thank you so much to our first 2 questions from Arlene and Mary. Now I'm going to move into a little bit more of a rapid fire style question section where we've got some questions where I won't kind of go into the chart. I'll just answer, a number in quick succession. So we've got a question here, and I'm sorry, I don't have the name for this person. Let's see if I can find it real quick. This question is about tips for a novice astrology student. And I do have lots of tips because I was once a novice astrology student, and I've also seen what works best in helping students build a solid foundation in astrology. So this question is from Anne-Marie. So Anne-Marie is asking, do you have any tips for a novice astrology student? There is so much information. What do you suggest focusing on and mastering as a beginner? And she also says very kindly, I admire you so much. Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's really lovely. So, learning astrology. I know there is so much out there. There are so many YouTube channels and books and blogs and astrologers everywhere. My best suggestion is to find a teacher whose style of astrology you like and take every possible course you can with them. The reason I suggest this is that it's partly how I went. I started reading astrology books in my early teens, around the age of 10 or 11. I'm not sure why. I grew up in a more traditionally religious home, but I was very interested in alternative spirituality. So I spent my teenage years reading any astrology book I could get my hand on. And that wasn't a lot because this was pre-internet, but I read what I could. I soaked in what I could. Not long after high school, I found an astrology teacher, and I was so thrilled to be able to go to astrology class once a week. And I studied with her for about 3 years. I learned everything she had to offer. She gave me my grounding in astrology. She has since passed away. Otherwise, I'd be happy to recommend her. And this was back in Sydney in Australia. And I learned everything I could from her. And she was teaching in what would be described as like a modern psychological style of astrology. So I learned everything I could with her, and that gave me a really solid foundation. I learned about the construction of the birth chart. I learned about the 12 houses. I learned about the planets. I learned about aspects. I learned about timing, like transits and progressions. After that, I continued my journey. I attended a couple of astrology conferences where I met more traditionally oriented astrologers, and that took me down the more historical rabbit hole of learning about older styles of astrology. And, 25 years later, that's kind of where I am now. And so, what I usually say to newer students, those of you who are fascinated by astrology and want to get started, you need a good grounding. And the best way to get that is not bouncing around via different astrologers on social media or YouTube. It's finding an astrologer whose style, whose point of view you really resonate with, that you can understand, that makes sense for you, and then letting them be your guide through the entry-level points to astrology. Mastering those birth chart basics will help you in any style of astrology. If you love astrologers that are practicing different styles of astrology to me, that's okay. Take the courses they have to offer. Once you have a grounding in one style of astrology, it's very easy to transfer that to other styles of astrology. But it's really confusing in the beginning to be learning about planetary condition or planets in a chart and be trying to learn 3 different styles of astrology at once. So that's what I always suggest is find a teacher whose style you enjoy and learn from them. Commit to anywhere from 2 to 4 years learning everything that teacher has to offer. And you'll know they're an established teacher if they have training programs that run over a year, 2 years, 3 years, that type of thing. So you want that structure that you can just dive into and you can be led along the way. We're going to start with this topic, then learn this topic, and then go here. One of the biggest mistakes I see newer people to astrology make is they try to do too much too soon and they get overwhelmed and then they leave astrology behind. And because I know how amazing astrology is, how helpful and how healing it can be, I really encourage students to slow down in the beginning so they can build a foundation that will keep them going for decades. In terms of me personally, I have so many free offerings that will be helpful. On YouTube, if you're listening to this podcast there is a beginner channel under my YouTube channel. So you can just watch a bunch of videos that are aimed at the beginner level. Many of you know that I have written for decades, and so there are a huge amount of beginner entry-level blog posts on my website. You can just start making your way through the back catalog there. And those things will get you started. I know not everyone is in a position where they can commit the time, energy, or money for learning astrology, but so there's lots of free resources there. I do have a blog post on my website called 5 Books to Help You Learn Traditional Astrology. And so that's a great resource if you think I want to invest in a couple of really good quality books. And then, of course, I do have a practical beginner astrology class, which is 6 weeks. So many people take astrology courses with other astrologers and then end up taking this beginner course of mine. So that's a good starting place if you want to just get a handle on things like how a chart is constructed, the houses, the signs, and how the signs and the houses work together. So there are a few tips that will hopefully help you build a steady, solid foundation in astrology without you getting overwhelmed. Speaking of traditional astrology, our next question asks for a brief comment on the floating midheaven and how I read it if the midheaven is in the 11th house with the IC in the 5th house. So this happens in the whole sign chart system where the midheaven degree is the same degree as it would be in a quadrant-based house system like Placidus or Co or Porphyry. So the midheaven degree will float around. And so sometimes in the whole sign chart format, the midheaven degree will be in the 9th house and it can be in the 11th house. On occasion, you'll see the midheaven degree sit and the midheaven itself sit inside the 12th house. So what we do in those instances, so first of all, we're going to think about the midheaven as the primary point about career and life direction. And we're going to think about the midheaven as the energy of the path of career for you. So if the midheaven isn't in the 10th house, it's going to be in a house that has its own set of topics and themes, and those topics and themes become important to your career. So if your midheaven sits in the 9th house, things like wisdom, learning, academia, travel, they all become part of work for you, as if your career energy is directing you towards experiences, settings, or industries that would be connected to the 9th house. If the midheaven is in the 11th house, we're going to have this sense of career being directed towards 11th house topics. So you might be thinking, I'm working with my friends, which is an 11th house topic. Yes, that's one possibility. What I see most with midheaven in the 11th house clients is that they work around community, organization, kind of even social, not social work per se, but social causes. The idea of working in a field or an industry that is contributing to the collective experience. So that was what we can see with the 11th house. And of course, if the midheaven's in the 11th house, the IC will be in the 5th house. If the midheaven's in the 9th house, the IC will be in the 3rd whole sign house. So if the IC sits in the 3rd whole sign house, we're going to know that siblings are a huge part of maybe childhood, upbringing, early life. It might be that as you get older, if the IC is in the 3rd house, that it's really important for you to be active in your local neighborhood or to have great things in your immediate community, which are all 3rd house things. If the IC falls in the 5th house, we might have this sense that children are a huge part of home and family for you, or having fun with the people that you live with could also be part of the IC in the 5th house. So that's a little bit about how I work with that. This question comes from Peace Panther Productions. And of course, if any of you have more questions on this, let me know in the comments below and I can say more in a future episode. I'm going to just see if we can find maybe one other quick question to round out today's episode. These might be 2 questions. I'll try to be as quick as I can. It's such great questions. So Lisa LePage is saying, I have natal Venus conjunct the South Node in Libra in the 9th whole sign house. And that happens to square her ascendant at 29 Capricorn. Lisa's wondering if this means that she would have trouble finding a romantic partner. And she's saying that she's 56 now and she has had trouble finding romantic partners her whole life. Are these placements indicative of being alone? So we're looking at Venus in Libra in the ninth house conjunct the South Node. For me personally, Lisa, the first planet that I would look to explore relationship topics for you would be the ruling planet of the seventh house. It's what I do with all my clients, in fact. If you're a Libra ninth house person, that tells me that you would have Aquarius on the first house, Aquarius ascendant, which means that Leo would be your descendant. So the first planet that I would really examine to give me more information about what may be going on or wrong where relationships are concerned is the sun. And I'd be looking at the sun's sign, house placement, and any aspects the sun itself is involved in. Then as a secondary planet, I would definitely go and look to Venus. So Venus is really strongly placed by sign in Libra, and of course she's on the South Node. Venus on the South Node can sometimes have some complications in a relationship, not necessarily attracting partners, but one of the complications with Venus on the South Node can be a person who gives a lot to a partner and doesn't always get a fair amount in return. That's a caution. Whether that's the Venus on the South Node or the ruler of the seventh on the South Node, that's a caution or a topic I often talk through with clients with that placement. Venus in Libra probably wouldn't have issues, attracting a partner. And really, for me, there are other pieces of information that I would want to look at in the chart to better answer this question for you, Lisa. And I'll share them just so that you will get a sense of my thinking. So because the sun rules the seventh house, are you a daytime chart or a nighttime chart? Is the sun of the sect of the chart, or is it night where the sun's power is a little bit reduced? That would be helpful info to know. Also, whether you're a day or a nighttime chart would let us know whether Venus is of sect or out of sect, and that would be helpful there as well. Plus, other aspects that the sun would have. So just based on this information, I personally wouldn't think that it's a guarantee of being alone. There may be some issues in partnership for things to be fair, that you may be giving more than you're receiving back, but there's more info that we would need. So they're the things to keep an eye on, Lisa, and that may hopefully give you some tips on where to look in your chart for more on that question. Our final question today comes from Alex, who is asking really about the fifth house and about fertility, which is also a topic I work with clients a lot on. And Alex says, I have Chiron in my natal fifth house in the sign of Leo. And Alex is wondering, is this a sign of not having kids at all or exploring alternative methods to kids? Does Chiron ever get healed during a lifetime for the house that it's in? Again, this might be a different answer to what you're expecting, but hopefully still helpful about the topic, Alex. Because I'm a traditionally oriented astrologer, I don't currently work with asteroids like Chiron. However, I do work with clients about the topic of fertility all the time. And how I approach that is, again, I would look at the ruling planet of the fifth house. So if you're a Leo fifth house in the whole sign chart, I would be looking to see where the sun is in the chart, what condition is it in by sign, what aspects is it making, are they helpful or not helpful? The other super important planet for fertility is the moon. So I would also look at the moon's sign, phase, and aspects. And they're the two main things that I would look at for fertility issues or fertility themes with a client. They give us our baseline as to sort of how receptive a chart might be to fertility and conception. And then we can adjust that based on timing factors. There are certain cycles, transits, progressions, and other timing factors like perfections that can be more or less helpful to our fertility journey. So we've got a baseline that we're starting from, and we can have more fertility indicators at certain ages or in certain transits and progressions. And there are certain transits and progressions that are less fertility indicators. So it's a real mix of looking at the baseline the natal chart starts from, and then when there might be cycles that are helpful for fertility and conception. For me personally, Chiron there would not be a barrier or a blockage to you having kids, but that's what I'd be looking at, the condition and place of the sun, plus those important factors of the moon. All right, team, thank you so much for joining me for this Q&A episode. There's so many more questions, so hopefully we'll be able to do a Q&A episode again next month. If you have a question you would like answered, please feel free to leave it in the comments section below. I do have classes on many of the topics that were asked about today. So I'm going to link those below. For instance, I have a class on fertility. I have a number of classes on relationships and figuring out relationship themes in the birth chart. And of course, I have classes on birth chart basics and how to read a chart. So I'll put all that info below. If you want to learn more, pop over to my website, kellysastrology.com. Either way, I will catch you here next week with more astrology. Until then, everyone, take care.